This is a brief overview of state judicial systems. We will talk a little bit more towards the end of the class about the judiciary in another context, but for now, I just wanted to give you a brief overview and talk about, in particular, the differences between state court systems and the federal court system. So the structure of state court systems looks familiar, but only to a certain extent. State court systems usually have a pyramid-like system at the top of which is a court of last resort, usually called a Supreme Court, but not always. States like Maryland and New York have to be confusing like that. New York is particularly confusing because their Supreme Court is actually a trial court, and their Court of Appeals is actually the court of last resort. Nothing that you need to actually remember right now, but that there is usually a court of last resort, usually called the Supreme Court. Then there is a level of intermediate appeals courts that mirrors in many ways the circuit court system on the federal level. Below that, though, are your trial courts, and then even below that are limited trial courts. So the trial court system is usually broken up, particularly the smaller dollar value cases, even more so, because of the extremely high number of cases in the system. They need to break up the cases, sometimes by subject matter, like probate courts or family courts, and sometimes by dollar amount. So you may hear people refer to small claims courts. It varies from state to state what the limited trial courts do, but they usually handle misdemeanors and smaller issues, and then there are the specialty ones, family and probate, and then trial courts, which deal with general matters of a certain dollar amount or more, and of higher order crimes like felonies. So if we look at Michigan's court system, we have the Supreme Court at the top, the courts of appeals, which are not called circuit courts, just courts of appeals below. Then there are the circuit courts, which are the general trial court level. For most things, though, you'll probably have to start in district court. District court are those things that are under a certain dollar value. It's misdemeanors, it's traffic violations, it's family court, it's probate court. All of those functions where you would normally start are probably in district court. Sometimes cities had a tendency to call them municipal courts. We tend not to do that anymore. They're just district courts within a municipality. They've been reformed a little bit, but there is that split in Michigan as well in the trial court level. So if we look at state judiciaries compared to federal ones, that says state E's there. I'm not sure why there's the extra E, but nevertheless, we'll see that the state courts are significantly larger in many cases than the federal bench, not just on an aggregate level, but sometimes on an individual level as well. So the federal bench is, according to your reading, I used those numbers, and that year when I compared it to numbers from the outside. There are 1,218 federal judges and justices. The states vary in size. So South Dakota, there's 57. New York, there's about 3,500. So you can see there's a wide range of a size of how many judges are in each system. Now, one way to look at the importance of judges and justices is how much they are paid. Your reading argues this probably more strongly than I would. The payment doesn't mean that they're not important or influential. Our federal judges, in comparison to what they could make in private practices, make actually very little. And it's really not that much more than what state court judges make. So there's not a huge variation that you can account for some of what they're trying to account for in that reading. So I would argue that the salaries probably isn't the best place to look. But that's the breakdown. And unsurprisingly, a state like California is the highest paid, and states like South Dakota, Mississippi, and Montana are the lowest paid. Um, the federal judiciary is entirely appointed. There are no elections for federal judges or justices. The states vary. 38 states have some, if not all, elections for judges. And this, as we'll talk about in a minute, greatly influences how judges act and how we think of judges. Um, Probably outside of the size of the bench, the best way to compare state judiciaries versus federal judiciary is the caseload. So your reading breaks this down, and it has the numbers in there. I looked at the federal caseload for the same time period, and without bankruptcy cases, there were 42,620 cases in 2008. If you added in the bankruptcy cases, it was just over 60,000. So the caseload, when you compare that to the state caseloads, there's just no comparison. The states take on the vast majority of the cases, which is why in many of my other classes, I talk about the fact that if you are going to ever see a judge, it's probably going to be a state judge. The odds of you having to go into federal court for anything, unless you're a lawyer, and sometimes even then, are very low. People interact far more frequently with the state court system, either on a formal or informal basis, and the caseload reflects that. So the biggest controversy in state judiciaries is whether or not the election of state judges is a good idea. State judges act differently than federal judges in some respects, and it's hard to trace whether this difference in activity is due to the fact that they are elected or whether that's just a result of something else. So the pros of electing our judges are that there is a time limit on which they can have the job. Federal judges are appointed for life or unless impeachment, or they retire or resign. On the other hand, state court judges, especially in the states where they have elections, might be term limited out. There might be age restrictions, so the Michigan Supreme Court automatically sets you up for retirement after age 70. There are pros to getting people out of the judiciary that should not be there, in particular for age as well. It also creates a sense of responsiveness to the electorate in certain matters, which might connect the judges back to the electorate better. The cons, though, are quite high, and the fact is that electing state judges sets up a system where the judges are usually asking for votes and campaign donations from the very people that argue cases before them, because those are their peers, the attorneys, the county bar associations, etc. Those are the people that usually argue before these judges, and then they're the people who end up paying into the campaigns for these judges. There's also business issues as well, that justices on a state level and judges that find more frequently for business interests tend to receive more business donations to their campaigns. So there's an issue of fundraising from peers, fundraising from subordinates. There's the pro-business votes and that problem. There's also the issue in states like Michigan, which tell our candidates for judges and for justice positions that they cannot be partisan, that they have to be nonpartisan. Now, this is so we're creating the view of an impartial judiciary. An impartial judiciary is hard to find, though, when they are elected. They're almost necessarily partial in some respects because they were selected for the role after running in an election. So we say that they have to be nonpartisan, and yet we allow parties in the state of Michigan to do things like nominate the candidates for state Supreme Court and endorse candidates for other judicial positions. So the partisanship rules exists. They say that the judges themselves can't set their parties, but that those around them can actually influence how their partisan cues are set up, which influences how the election goes. There's also one kind of larger issue, which is that most people voting don't know a whole lot about politics, and what they do know usually stops when it comes to judges. Unless you know someone running for a judicial position personally, or maybe you've had a bad experience with a judge, you would have no real reason to know a person running for a judicial position. So voter knowledge is usually at its lowest with these positions. That means necessarily that on top of the caseload, on top of the size of the bench, we have one final and fairly large distinction between the state judiciaries and the federal judiciary. And that is one of somewhat of legitimacy, but of not of the branch itself, but kind of the judicial actors. That federal judges are viewed as much more important than state judges and justices. And this is reinforced by the idea that federal justices have a seemingly more sacrosanct appointment apparatus than election system, in part. We do have a system of appointments for vacancies that come up due to resignation, removal from office, or death. So in that case, the governor may appoint someone to take it, a position, but they have to run for re-election the following time. So there are people who have pushed back against this, who have tried to change this in various ways. But at least in the state of Michigan and many of the other states, none of those have ever been serious attempts, and I doubt that they will be anytime soon. So that brings us to the end. Basically just wanted to overview some of the highlights here and talk about the idea that judges on a state level are usually elected, not selected.